Welcome everybody to the Career Accelerator lecture, the first of two for the fall of 2023. The Career Accelerator lecture series is sponsored by and started by the School of Engineering Advisory Board. The advisory board felt that it would be good to provide an opportunity for students to learn from senior professionals that have been out there for a while and have seen things and done things and had a series of experiences, mostly good, sometimes not so good, but a series of experiences that they can share to help you get off to an accelerated start as you start with your career. These are intended to be fun. We've got the pizza. I hope you had a chance to get pizza. If you're in my class, by the way, there's a sign-up sheet over there. I encourage you to sign up. My name is Bob Parsons, by the way, and I've got the very, very good pleasure of hosting these. And they're always great. And we're excited today to welcome Warren Evans. So the way this is going to work is I'll introduce him, and then he's going to speak for 30-ish minutes, and then we'll have questions at the end. So that's how this works. It's also being recorded on Zoom and will be posted on the School of Engineering website, so you can share it with your friends if they missed it. It will be there as all the previous Career Accelerator lectures are there now. And there are some really good ones. So, in fact, they're all really good, but there are some especially good ones on all sorts of topics ranging from personal finance to career growth and communication and leadership and all kinds of great stuff to help you get started as you start your career. So with that, Warren Evans is here to speak with us today. Warren Evans has 45 years. He's a climate envoy for the Office of the President of the Asian Development Bank. He has 45 years of sustainable development and climate change experience from multilateral development banks, private organizations, and other international organizations. He received a bachelor's from Kansas State University focused on ecology and a master's at the University of Kansas here in environmental health engineering. He has served as an advisor on environmental policy and environmental impact assessment to the new National Environment Board of Thailand from 1978 to 1982. He then co-founded and was managing partner of a boutique environmental consulting firm based in Thailand and working across Asia. In 1988, Warren joined the Asian Development Bank based in Manila and the Philippines, and during the 15-year tenure there, he undertook progressing roles from environmental specialist to director of the Environmental and Social Safeguards Division. From 2003 to 2013, he worked at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C., as Environment Director and Senior Advisor for Sustainable Development. During this period, he led the establishment of the Climate Investment Funds and supported the senior management on a range of issues such as climate change, biodiversity, conservation, and institutional operations. He served as Senior Advisor Consultant from 2013 to 2017, where he provided advisory service on a variety of strategic issues on sustainable development and climate change. He returned to the Asian Development Bank as a Special Project Facilitator in September 2017. He has led the problem-solving function, keeping the accountability mechanism effective. In September 2021, he was appointed Special Senior Advisor for Climate Change, Climate Envoy, Office of the President, where he supports the development of the Asian Development Bank's climate strategy and represents the Asian Development Bank internationally on climate change. Wow, that's a mouthful. That's a lot of experience, and we're looking forward to a great talk from Warren, so please welcome Warren Evans.
Thanks, Bob. And it's great to be here. I want to, before we get started, I need to know who I'm talking to. So, how many of you are in engineering school? Good, I did this for you. How many of you are undergrads? How many of you just came to get some pizza? Okay, there was one. One honest person. So, Bob, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here. I also want to thank my siblings who came here. So the people who are a little bit beyond normal undergrad age are back there. I'm not even the oldest person in the room. Also an old friend from ADB days, John Head, who's a professor in the law school here. And I saw that my sister and brother-in-law are on Zoom from Colorado, so what a world we live in now. I also want to thank Alan Risley, who you probably don't know, but is one of the more, not famous, but successful engineering grads from KU, and very active with the Alumni Association here. And he grew up in Great Bend, Kansas with us, and that's part of my story. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to break this into 3 parts. I'm going to talk first a little bit about my career and what triggered changes, since you're here thinking about career. My career has virtually been all international, so if you're not interested in international, just eat your pizza and enjoy. But I'm going to then talk about what I see as the big game changer for you as engineers, which is climate change. And I'll talk first, I'm going to try and give you a little tour of my backyard, Asia and Pacific, half the world, and the kind of climate impacts that we're seeing today and are going to get worse and worse over time. And then talk finally about how I see that affecting the engineering community, what's already happening and where you need to be thinking about going in the future. So I started out, grew up I was born in 1951. By the time I was in high school, there were 2 defining features in the United States of America. One was awful, that was the Vietnam War, and the second was very positive, that was environment, the environmental movement. So I'm not going to talk about the Vietnam War, I'm going to talk about the environmental movement because it affected the engineering profession dramatically. So in 1969, NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, was passed, and that required a whole change in how urban communities, municipalities, companies dealt with pollution. So where we were growing up in Great Bend, the local pig slaughterhouse discharged its waste directly into the Arkansas River. If you're from Kansas, you call it the Arkansas River. If you're from anywhere else, it's the Arkansas. But it was direct discharge into the Arkansas River, right probably upstream, I'm guessing, of the intake structure for our water supply system. That was the world we lived in then. Pollution was awful, water pollution, air pollution in the big cities. Solid waste management was you were lucky if you had an open dump that was reasonably managed. So NEPA changed all that. And one of the things that NEPA did was it introduced the requirement for environmental impact assessment for major projects, both federal, mainly federal projects initially, but later on any major initiative that touched on federal lands or had certain criteria. And I was really lucky because I got involved in the environmental impact assessment world, in the profession, when it first started. So in 1972, when I moved to Lawrence, I was already working on environmental impact assessments for USDA, Department of Agriculture, mainly up in northeast Kansas and southeast Nebraska. Then I had an opportunity, what happened, the environmental movement was moving, the government passed laws. Well, guess what? There weren't any people to actually go do the work that needed to be done. So all of a sudden EPA, which was a relatively new organization at that time, was giving grants right and left, all over the place. And our other brother was already in grad school here. He told me about this, and I submitted some really simple form to EPA and got a grant to go to grad school at KU, and got my environmental engineering science. So I'm not a civil guy, I'm an ecology guy who went into environmental engineering science, mainly focused on water quality. Did my research here, and this building wasn't here. We had a pretty funky old lab upstairs. I built the first continuous flow bioassay apparatus that KU had. It was hopefully destroyed as soon as I left. But one of the things I did was, I realized that I wanted to work internationally, and this is where Great Bend comes in. Not everybody wants to live in Great Bend their whole life. I was one of them that didn't, and I didn't even want to live in Kansas my whole life. So I checked with my fellow grad students, and turned out one of them had an uncle who was living in Bangkok, Thailand, and was pulling together a team with financing from USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, and they needed an environmental impact assessment person. Well, you know, typically people who get that kind of work are 40, 50, 60 years old. So, but EIA was a brand new profession, so I was able to get a job in Thailand as soon as I finished here, which stimulated me to finish here. So I wrote a thesis really, really fast. I'm sure it was never advertised as a bestseller here, but it got me my master's degree, and so I moved to Thailand. So that's how I got into the international game. In Thailand, I worked on environmental impact assessment, environmental policy, working with the government, and a fascinating experience all over Thailand, and then regionally moved to the Asian Development Bank because I was working on EIA and ADB. The multilateral development banks in the late 80s were adopting environmental criteria, environmental regulations. John was probably part of it at ADB, but they didn't have any standards. We didn't have environmental quality standards, and we certainly didn't have requirements for environmental impact assessment for the kinds of projects we finance, most of which are infrastructure, the kind of things that you guys will all be working on. So I was hired to come in and help design and implement a program where we would have environmental impact assessment requirements, and then that led to doing a lot of really, really interesting on-the-ground project-level work across Asia and Pacific. My best years were the first years in the Pacific. I spent 4 years just wandering around the Pacific Islands helping them to develop environment programs, and then did a lot of work across Asia. I was fortunate. Did the first project in Vietnam when Vietnam opened back up to international organizations like ours. So I had a great time really doing on-the-ground real work until I got into management. And then overnight you turn into a bureaucrat and you forget all the stuff you used to do, and you just manage. And that's what I did for many, many years, including when I went to the World Bank. Then retired, and ADB asked me to go back, and I've been having a lot of fun the last few years really focused on the climate agenda, which is absolutely critical in our region. So that's sort of a snapshot of how I got to where I am. We can talk about triggers and the kinds of things that questions you might have about why do you do this, why don't you do that, how do I get here, how do I avoid that. We can talk about that later, and I may or may not be very inspiring when I respond to you. But one thing I can tell you as undergrads, if you're going to work internationally, you've got to have a grad degree. You're not gonna make it with a bachelor's. So if you want to work internationally, and it's a lot of fun, and it's where the action is, then get your bachelor's, go to work for 3-4 years, come back to KU, get your master's, and if you have the patience, then go ahead and get your PhD. It's all critical for international work. And I don't know, John, whether that's true for lawyers, but for engineers, it definitely is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little tour of Asia and Pacific. Climate change will affect every country. It'll affect every person on this planet. It already is, particularly in the most vulnerable, poorest populations in my region. So these are just a few headlines from the last few months. The most vulnerable and least resilient households are in countries in my region. So Asia Pacific has an unbelievably diverse set of countries, unbelievably diverse set of populations, religions, you name it, and it's got everything there. Huge cities, very rural areas. It is, in general, it is the highest exposed to climate impacts when you look at the population of poor people and the diversity of the kinds of impacts that climate change drives and the kinds of resilience required to actually overcome those. Last year, 2022, there were 81 weather, climate, and water-related disasters in Asia and Pacific. 5,000 people, more than 5,000 people lost their lives. More than 50 million people were directly affected, and more than $36 billion in losses. So I'm going to kind of break this down by my backyard. So I'll start with the Pacific. the big one is Papua New Guinea, and then you come on down all the way down to Cook Islands and everything in between. So the Pacific is, I don't think this will come to any surprise to you, but these are by far the most vulnerable in terms of populations that will eventually have to move. Particularly in the atoll states, they are highly vulnerable to climate impacts. So the, sorry, I lost my place here. And I'm going to come to Tonga here in a minute, where remember that these are small populations. They contributed nothing to climate change. They have virtually no emissions at all, but they're feeling the brunt of it. And in 2018, Tonga was hit with Cyclone Gita, which was the strongest storm they've had in 60 years, 177-mile-an-hour winds. 80% of Tonga population was directly affected. It wiped out the parliament, it wiped out their airport, wiped out all their infrastructure. So these are the kind of events that these countries face, and they always have. The difference now is they're more frequent and they're more intense. So the frequency and intensity, you hear that in climate change over and over again. The frequency and intensity is what's changing. These countries face huge risks, and in particular the atoll countries, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, and these are the atolls in the north of the Pacific. At least 50% of those populations will have to move. And in fact, in 2000, I worked on a project in Marshall Islands where we had to raise the entire water supply system simply because sea level rise and increased storm surge was getting salt water into the system. And as you know, as civil engineers, that's not a good design for a water supply system. Then we'll go to Southeast, East, and South Asia. And I want to, what I'd like to do is first focus on the coastal area. So not the whole landmass, but if you go from for your left-hand side, that's the edge of Pakistan. It comes down around India, around Bangladesh, and then Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the islands down there, Philippines, and then over to China, Vietnam, and so on. So that coastal area, you have about somewhere around what's happening here? Around, here we go. I've lost a page here, sorry. That coastal area has around 220,000 kilometers of coastline. 220,000 kilometers, that's what, 150, 160,000 miles of coastline in that area. Within 3 miles of the shoreline, there are somewhere around 280 million people living in that stretch. Those people are affected by sea level rise, storm surge, increased storms, coastal erosion, and these are poor, unbelievably poor fishing villages, smallholder farm villages, and so on. Those people are getting blasted all the time, and the only way that they can survive the impacts of climate change will be to adapt. So a lot of what we talk about is adaptation. Then we're going to go to the cities. And I'd like to take a look at the populations of these cities. These are the big coastal cities across Asia. Mumbai, 24, almost 25 million people now in that area. About 9 million people in that city live in low-lying slums. And those low-lying slums have always flooded. The reason they're slums and poor people live there is because they get flooded all the time. That flooding has happened forever. They've been affected for a long time, but now the increased frequency and intensity of rainfall is resulting in flooding that's, instead of lasting for a week, it'll last for a month. Instead of being ankle deep, it's knee deep or waist deep. And what happens there is not just the economic impacts of flooding. It also is, if you've been in those kind of situations, basically there is no wastewater management. There's no solid waste management. You're lucky if there's a decent water supply. So they have pit latrines for their waste. They have open dumps for the solid waste. When floods go through that kind of stuff, it flushes out all the pathogens that you guys are studying about in environmental engineering courses. Those people are exposed to those pathogens now for extensive periods of time. So the public health impacts of this increased flooding in these cities, and we're talking about millions and millions of poor people exposed, are severe. And then in addition to that, they can't go to school, they can't get to health care, they can't go to work. So the kind of impacts of flooding on these populations, and primarily flooding, storm surge and inland flooding, is severe. So this is just give you an idea of the kind of situation. We can show those later on if you want. Then I'm going to move up to Central and South Asia, which is, again, I'd like to look more inland here. So not the coastal area, but more inland. There's a stretch of land which is almost all smallholder farmers. These people have less than a hectare if they're lucky. So they're not even an acre. They're nothing like what we see around here. Very small plots of land and barely eke out a living. A lot of it is just subsistence living. They are the poorest of the poor. They're affected by the increased droughts, the increased flooding, the heat waves that we're feeling now, that you guys felt, and I'll come back to that in a minute. These are the most vulnerable people around in terms of long-term climate impacts, things that will move them into a worse state of poverty, and in many cases, people will have to just move out. And I'll talk about Pakistan for that. So Pakistan has been experiencing a very long heat wave in 2022. That led to it was about 122 degrees. So you guys had 102 degrees with 135 degree or something like that, the heat index. Their temperature was 122. It's dry, so they don't have the humidity, but the extreme heat waves are really increasing in frequency and intensity. And in fact, poor kids in that part of the world, 76% of kids in South Asia were exposed to extreme high temperature compared to about 32% globally. So in Pakistan, they had these unbelievable heat waves, and that led to, I hope you are aware of the floods that they experienced in August 2022. Those floods left one-third of the country, covered one-third of the country. It affected about a third of the population. 1,600 people lost their lives, and the economic costs in a poor country was about $30 billion, or 9% of their GDP. That's just huge. So these are the so they get hammered with a heat wave, wipes out half their crop, and then they get hammered with a flood. And the flooding here is quite interesting because it's actually part of the source of the flooding is climate change in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, which I'm going to come around to later on, because of the permafrost melting at the top and having rain instead of snow at the top of the highest mountains in the world. That affected all these poor people downstream, along with a lot of rain, their normal rain. So now we're going to move to the Mekong Delta. So this is Vietnam. Mekong Delta is down at the bottom of this area. This is the breadbasket for rice for Asia. There are a lot of places that grow a lot of rice, but the most intense rice production is here. And these people are already, just so happens that the Mekong Delta, that area in the South China Sea, is one of the places where sea level rise is happening at the fastest pace. So sea level rise is not equal everywhere in the world. Ask a Floridian, right? So but in Asia, it's probably the Mekong Delta that is getting hit the hardest. So you've got a bunch of dams built upstream. Very bad idea. In China and Laos, That reduces the dry weather flow, the dry season flow. Then you've got salinity intrusion and increased storms, so storm surge. And so what's happened is severe salinity intrusion into this area. So it's estimated that about 1 million of poor farmers and fishers, there's a lot of fisheries there too, are going to end up here in Ho Chi Minh City in about 15, 20 years. So 1 million migrants into a city that's already under-infrastructured, already overtaxed in terms of being able to deliver urban services, having a very marginal wastewater management, marginal solid waste management programs, and virtually no flood control drainage. So it's not a, that's the kind of migrations that we're looking at going forward. Then if we go to Mongolia and Central and West Asia, and this is a huge part of the world to look at in one swath, and you've got deserts, you've got mountains, you've got beautiful, fertile farm country. So everything from Mongolia across that in terms of land use and ecosystems is there. What's interesting is that the climate impacts are going to be pretty severe across that region, but not many people have studied it because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So the savannas in Mongolia are already suffering. The grasslands, herders are having to move into the cities because they don't have any they can't graze their cattle anymore. In part of the area is reliant on two rivers, the Sri Darya and the Amudarya. Those are going to lose probably 50% of their flow by the end of this century, 30% maybe by 2050. Uzbekistan, I don't know who knows where Uzbekistan is? All right, good. So they're already severely short of water. The other thing that's happening in this region is landslides. So the mountains across from Georgia and Tajikistan, 36% of the land area in Tajikistan already prone to landslide. In Georgia, we have a hydro project that I did some work on when I came back to ADB up in the mountains, and we had landslides that totally wiped out the tunnels for the hydro project and had to be completely rebuilt. Nobody predicted these landslides, and they've had landslides for a long time, but now with climate change, with the changes in the winter, changes in the summer, changes in rainfall, temperatures and so on, they're much more prone to landslides. Okay, next we're going to go to the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So this is a huge region, and it's really important to recognize. So the Hindu Kush Himalaya are those cleverly placed mountains. That's the actual mountain range. So from kind of Afghanistan, Pakistan, across to actually to the right at the edge of the Mekong, the headwaters of the Mekong. But if you can see the drainage area that is reliant on the water from those mountains, it's huge. So much of China, all of Southeast Asia, much of Southeast Asia, and the big ones are in Bangladesh and India and Pakistan. So the Brahmaputra River, or the Ganges River, and I'm forgetting one. Anyway, these are major river systems that have huge populations. So what'll happen initially, because of glacial melt, climate change, glacial melt, and changes in rainfall patterns in the high mountains, initially what will happen is in the high mountains, like in Nepal, you'll see GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods. And this is a 1921 setting, 2009. So increased landslides, and these are going to become very common. In fact, please look at I don't know if you can see up there in the corner, a sign on the left side. Please pay attention to that. This is the intake structure of the Melamchi water supply. Anybody from Nepal? Okay. So the Melamchi water supply is a project that ADB financed. I worked on it eons ago. It took a long time to build. We were just getting ready to commission that intake structure. And a GLOF, basically a glacial lake outburst flood, because of heavy rains in the high mountains, came down. And actually, it's interesting. This is an interesting story for those of you who are interested in geology as well. So in 2015, there was a severe earthquake in Nepal, affected a huge part of Nepal. What we didn't know is it also loosened up the natural dams for these glacial lakes. And so, sure enough, enough water, enough melt of the glacier, runoff from the high mountains, melt from the glacier, weakened dam, way, way up above that intake structure, a landslide. That landslide burst the next dam, burst the next dam, and so eventually, because that intake structure is not that high in the mountains, but the landslides came down and covered this, and it's going to be at least, we thought we were going to be able to rebuild it and have it functioning in 2 or 3 years. About 3 weeks ago, another gloff. So the landslides hit again, and now we have to redesign the whole thing and completely change the intake structure. That water supply is for Kathmandu Valley, the entire valley, which has been short on water for as long as I've been working there, which is longer than most of you have been around. So that's the reality of the Himalaya Hindu Kush. So the other thing about climate change is that climate change impacts are very heavily gendered. So women and children are by far the most exposed, disproportionately exposed to the impacts of climate change, particularly in poor communities. So if you think about in Asia, most of the water is carried by the women and children. And believe it or not, in areas where there are not community taps, but taps that are spaced further apart, the average walking distance is about 3.5 kilometers to carry water for these women and children. So just the fact that it's going to be hotter, drier, makes it difficult. There's also a literacy point. 48% of women in Cambodia are still illiterate, rural women. So they don't have the voice. They don't have the ability to really say when they're making decisions about how they should adapt to and become resilient to climate impacts. But they're out there working in the farms. If you have a heat wave like you guys had 2 weeks ago, you simply cannot work out there. It's not only unhealthy, but you're likely to keel over. They can't work because of that. So what do they do for food? What do they do for income? And it's generally the women who worry about these things in poor households. They worry about where the food comes from. They're likely to forego their own. So we're doing a lot of work right now on climate change and gender. And it's actually, the more you dig into it, the more you realize how disproportionate the impacts are and how poorly the governments are handling this, because governments in Asia anyway are mostly run by men, and they don't get it. So there's a huge, huge challenge on the gender issues around climate change and kids as well. They are by far the most vulnerable. So finally, let me wrap up on this little tour and just say that, so just to say that, again, to reiterate, the poorest of the poor are the most vulnerable. They are not resilient to climate impacts. The climate impacts that they're feeling today are going to get worse. They're going to be more intense, more frequent. We're probably not going to see new kinds of impacts. We've kind of experienced probably what we're going to experience. It's just going to be more and more intense. So we've got to focus on climate resilience in a big way. That doesn't mean that we ignore the fact that we've also got to go net zero. So the final, I don't know what happened, but the final picture on this is supposed to be a big windmill that we're actually building. So there's a huge amount of renewable energy going in place. So I'm talking about the impacts of climate change because I want to talk about how that affects you as engineers. But the opportunities that climate change demands we take in terms of decarbonizing a very heavily carboned world, and to move into renewables and greater energy efficiency across the board, new technologies that some of you might have a chance to work on, green hydrogen, steel, or green cement, these are unbelievable opportunities and a huge amount of work being done. So don't forget the low carbon part. I focused on the impacts because I want to relate that to what you guys will be, assuming if you're civil engineers, you're going to mainly be dealing with infrastructure, right? That's what you normally do. The engineering world today is already recognizing that it's got to change, and I'm sure that the educators are already there, but the American Society of Civil Engineers, for example, and the World Engineering Federation, Federation of Engineering Societies, all of them are working together now to come up with a whole new set of standards, a whole new set of ethics that require engineers to take into account the kinds of impacts that I was talking about. To take into account, when you design something, the reality that if you're building a hydro project, if you have a hydro project, dam, if you're building a flood control system, designing a flood control system, it almost doesn't matter what you're designing. You can no longer just simply go back and look at what history tells us. A 100-year flood is, for someone working on a flood control project, is absolutely meaningless today. So you guys are going to be doing engineering with much higher levels of uncertainty going forward than what my dad, who was a civil engineer, my grandfather, who was a civil engineer, that they dealt with. You're going to have uncertainties that nobody has ever dealt with, which to me is not only scary, but an unbelievable opportunity. But it means a lot of things. It means you've got to be at the table when it comes to deciding what's going to be built and where it's going to be built. Engineers can't sit back and wait for the instructions to come. You've got to be involved in the discussion of deciding what's built and where it's built. And that doesn't happen a lot. But you've got to change that if you're going to be successful, if you're going to deal with this challenge. You've got to look much more at the equity side. You can't just rely on the social scientists to tell you, oh, you have to be fair to everybody. You as engineers have to make sure that there's equity in what you design and what you build. That the people who have the least resilience to these kind of impacts, the people who have the least ability to take decisions on their own, on what they can do to get out of this other than migrate, you need to make sure that they are included in the thought process of designing infrastructure. And I can tell you that across Asia, and even the Pacific's better because they're very small communities, but across Asia that doesn't happen very much. If you work in an institution like mine, the demand will be there from day one. But it wasn't there 10 years ago. It wasn't. And so these are all, you're going to live through an unbelievable change in the engineering profession. The civil engineering profession, the environmental engineering, I don't care, actually, lawyers, business people, but mainly engineers are going to, of all types, are going to have to adjust to this new reality. You can say that it's not real. That's your right. I would suggest you go into a different profession if you have that view, because it is real and it is going to affect each and every one of you. So I hope that you are being taught that in your classes. I hope you're getting to, maybe you can tell me, is anybody talking to you about nature-based solutions when you talk about a design for something? Is that part of your curriculum? How do you maximize the use of nature before you pour concrete? So now that's the hottest thing going right now in the climate change world and in the development world, is given the terrible situation for biodiversity, for nature, for ecosystems, quality of ecosystems, climate change is actually providing an opportunity. It's a perverse opportunity, but it's an opportunity to actually invest more in biodiversity conservation than we've seen in the last 20 years. And the reason is there's a recognition that a lot of, for example, that coastline I showed, that 220,000 kilometer coastline, I'd guess, this is a guess, so don't quote me, I'd guess half of that is severely degraded. And much of that can be improved in terms of resilience to climate events, in terms of productivity of ecosystems. It's not building a seawall, it's replanting, regenerating mangroves, rehabilitating wetlands, the natural system for climate resilience. So much of hopefully what, when you graduate from KU, on your, underneath your Bachelor of Engineering, it says specialized in nature-based solutions, because that is the future. So that means you got to understand a little bit about ecology, ecosystem services. So that is going to be part of the engineering profession. It's already, the ASCE is already plugging it in to the new code of ethics for civil engineers. It's already happening. So, again, I think that you've got an unbelievable challenge, but an unbelievable opportunity to really lead at a time where leadership is going to be absolutely essential from your community. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again and happy to have a discussion.
All right, questions?
Yep.
One thing I'd like to get your opinion on, I quite like a lot of the environmental solutions they're coming out with, but one thing I don't really get is the push for electric vehicles, because there's a whole lot environmental damage that happens in the creation, like the mining of lithium, huge humanitarian concerns with the mining of cobalt, and then transporting all the materials and processing them. Like, is electric vehicles really the way to go?
Well, I think the answer is yes, but your observation is correct. So if you remember the picture of Kathmandu Valley there. Kathmandu, when I first worked there, I could see all the mountains around me. It's been probably since 1990 you couldn't see the mountains anymore. The pollution in Kathmandu Valley is severe. The part of the solution is the use of electric vehicles, a big part of the solution. And the cool thing is that because they have a lot of hydropower, it's green electric vehicles. So the question that you ought to be asking in addition to the one you asked, and by the way, you should be asking that question on life cycle analysis for everything we do. So if we don't change the way we make steel, if we don't change the way we make cement, then we've got a huge amount of carbon embedded into everything that you guys are going to build. That change is taking place. But for electric vehicles, the way we look at it is, because we make tough decisions on what we finance. So we do finance a lot of EV work. We just did a loan to Bangkok for a new electric bus system. In many of the cities in Asia, shifting to EV is worth it from a public health point of view because of air quality. Never mind the carbon. The local air quality makes a huge difference. You can justify it on that basis. So if we can have a commitment from a country that they're ready to shift away from fossil fuel-based energy and towards clean energy, and then use that to really fuel EVs, then we'll support it. It is a trade-off, but I guarantee that until we have something better that doesn't emit carbon in the air, then we're better off even with the kinds of problems that you're talking about. But everything we look at, you should, as engineers, start looking at the life cycle costs of that at least in terms of carbon.
I was wondering how you felt about geoengineering to buy the planet more time to transition from fossil fuels to electricity. Are you familiar with the term bioengineering?
Yeah, sure. So anything we can come up with that will actually work, and we know what the outcome is likely to be, and that's the risk there, is we don't know, I'm all for it. But I think that is not an excuse to not shift away from carbon-based living. So, no matter what technology we come up with, and I'm not a big believer in the geoengineering stuff. If it works, great. I am a big believer in carbon capture and storage. So if you guys are any petroleum engineering guys here, then you're going to be out of work in a few years. But if you get carbon capture and storage, you might be able to stay in your field. But there's nothing on the horizon that gives me or any of my peers a sense of comfort that we don't have to decarbonize, that we don't have to go to net zero. And if we don't go to net zero by 2050, then these impacts are not only going to continue on, they're going to get worse. And by the way, I forgot to mention that even if we stop all emissions of carbon today, you're still going to have this stuff happen for the next 20 years. So your careers, you know, you're safe in your careers if you focus on how to deal with this.
Another question. Let's go over here, and if you could repeat what his question is.
Oh, okay, sure.
Would nuclear energy be the ultimate solution?
Sorry?
Would nuclear energy be the ultimate solution for renewable energy needs?
The question is, would nuclear energy be the ultimate solution? And I don't think there is an ultimate solution. Is nuclear energy part of the solution? My view is yes, but a lot of people like to hit me over the head when I say that, because it's almost a religious thing for some people. And that's understandable if you've experienced the kinds of things that happen in Japan and elsewhere. But my view is yes, that we're not going to shift enough, fast enough and big enough in the developing world to reduce carbon emissions without nuclear, preferably in the developed world. And I think it's part of the solution. But a lot of people do not agree with me.
I'm curious about your thoughts. Environmental assessments came out of a need to reflect on the environmental impact of these projects that were developing in the 70s and 80s, but there's a lot of opinion now that they're being weaponized to prevent kind of future clean energy projects. Do you see that being a problem in Asia Pacific?
Not where I'm coming from, that's not an issue. I think that's more of a, if you want to call it north-south, it's more of a northern issue. And I hope that they overcome it real fast. It's not what NEPA was designed, it's not what EIA was designed for, right? Yeah.
I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but how much of your job involves breaking through like environmental barriers set up by people that maybe want money or don't want certain things to happen?
The question is, how much of my job is breaking through or overcoming barriers of people who don't want environmental stuff and don't want to pay attention to this? A lot. I spend, I'll tell you, it's a lot easier talking to you guys and a lot more fun than if I'm talking to a whole bunch of ministers who believe that it's a trade-off between environment and development or climate and development. And it's clearly not. Sustainable development is environment, it is climate, and it is social, and it is a whole bunch of other things. But we still, on our board of directors, which, well, never mind, I won't comment on them. We still have people on our board of directors who argue that, hey, we shouldn't be doing all this climate stuff. We need to focus on development. And our response will, if you focus on development without taking into account this stuff, it's not going to work. Why would you invest in something that's going to fail? Doomed to failure. But they still, it's embedded. So I spend a lot of time on that. It's sort of I forgot to mention, one of the challenges you guys have, I think Bill Gates, in a book that he was talking about, he talked about if you build the bridge too low, it's going to get washed away. If you build it too high, you're going to waste a tremendous amount of money. That's decision making with uncertainty. That's what you guys are going to be faced, is how high do you build that bridge so that you don't get it washed away, but so you don't waste a lot of money. And the risk is, if you go to the mayor of Mumbai, and you talk about helping him or her build a new flood control program, and you design it for what you think is a relatively low risk so maybe you design it for what would today, 10 years ago, be called a 1 in 1,000 year flood. You design it, you build it, and the next year you got a 1 in 2,000 year flood. And all of a sudden it's your fault that you spent all this money and you didn't build something that would account for that. That's the kind of uncertainties that you're going to face, because you won't have those handy charts you know, that civil engineers that, you know, you just looked up, where are you and what's a 100-year flood and here's what your pipe size is. You can't do that anymore. Not going to work.
All right, back here, another question?
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask if you've ever worked with, or your organization is planning on working with GMOs. So like you talked about replanting mangroves. Well, that takes hundreds of years to develop. What about making a GMO version of that that can grow in 20 years?
Well, the question is, do we work with GMOs and using mangroves as an example? The cool thing about mangroves is you don't need GMOs. You just plop them in the ground, they grow really fast. So they're really easy to replant. It's muddy, you know, it's messy, but they really are. That's why they're so good. But if you're talking about a lot of other, you know, if you talk about food security, for example, if you talk about the Mekong Delta, absolutely there's a lot of research going on using GMOs that are salt resistant, that are salinity resistant. So there is, in my part of the world, the sensitivity around GMOs is very low. They just want food. They want to be able to have a crop. They want to be able to withstand the kinds of heat waves and so on. So for us, it's not a big deal. We don't actually ask what crop they're going to grow. We finance them to grow crops. But it's a great question because I think it is, you know, the reality is we don't have time for a lot of the natural processes to take place. So we have to go in and engineer them, whether it's GMOs or, you know, putting a retaining wall around a wetland, which is not natural at all, but it gets your wetland back tomorrow. So we have to do those things. We call that gray infrastructure.
What would you say to those who claim that the climate change might exist but it's not man-made, that the Earth just naturally goes through warm and cold cycles?
So the question is, what do I say to people who are climate change deniers in terms of it being man-made, in terms of being anthropogenic? My response is really simple. And I've had very senior people point at me and say, this is a hoax. My response is really simple. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm an old bureaucrat environment guy with emphasis on old. But if 98% of the scientists in this world are in agreement that it is anthropogenic, that it is causing these things, who am I to question them? That'd be like questioning the doctors who tell me don't smoke, right? Yep.
As a follow-up, technically the appeal to authority is an invalid argument, but that also recently a large group of scientists, I think it was well over 1,000, signed a declaration saying that there is no climate emergency. So are you think we're stifling debate about climate change?
No, I think that's still a very small minority. And if you look into the literature and look at the background of those scientists, they're all over the place. They're a scientist. I'm a scientist, but I'm not claiming to know the technical details of whether this is man-made or not. So, but your first response, technically that's not a valid answer, is correct. But are you in law school or engineering?
I think logical thinking is very important no matter where you are.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to invite you to talk to John because maybe you'd go to law school too. But it is a good question. But I do think, look, it's a valid observation, but don't we all listen to experts? Is that wrong? So that's what we have to go on. I'd rather listen to the bulk of the scientists than Fox News on climate change. I think that's a more valid source of information. But everybody's got to pick their own thing. What I don't do is I don't try and convert anybody. I gave that up a long time ago.
2 minutes, another question.
Yeah, I got this question. Like, for example, there are some solutions for clean energy, for example, the hydropower, but there are some claims to talk about it, like the hero power might affect the flow of water, and it's also causing the pollutions. So what do you think about the clean energy, but it's still have result in pollution?
Yeah. So hydropower is renewable energy for sure, unless there's a severe drought upstream. So Western Nepal, your country, has built a whole bunch of dams in the western part of the country, and all of a sudden now they're having droughts, and they're not getting it. But it is renewable energy, and it is clean energy. What it does, though, is it has, depending on if it's a big dam with a big reservoir, the environmental impacts, the social impacts, almost anywhere are huge. Very difficult to manage, and so we don't fund much of that and haven't for a long time. However, if there are places, and I was just working on one in Nepal not long ago, where you can find a nice spot in a gorge and have a run-of-the-river type hydro, or a series of those, and it's very clean, low impact, and if you design it right, it has very few impacts on the fisheries, virtually no pollution impacts. And so it is, and it's a great source of renewable energy. But it is, it's compared now to solar or wind. If you can do solar and wind, it's so much cheaper because hydro is unbelievably expensive, particularly if you have to resettle people. There's one over here.
One more question over here.
Do you think in the next 1 or 2 decades, will there be a breakthrough with tidal electric stations? And have you ever encountered tidal electric stations and worked with them?
Yeah, so the question is, do I think in the next decade or two there will be a breakthrough on tidal energy generation? And the answer is yes. I'm surprised that it hadn't already happened. I was promised by General Electric when I was at the World Bank in 2011 that they were that close to getting there. But yes, I believe that there are some new technologies that are, some things like floating solar are growing unbelievably fast. So it's solar, that's not new, but floating solar is relatively new. But yeah, there are some new geothermal type research going on that I think will open up a lot of new, even at the household level, opportunities. And but definitely the wave energy and the current, using ocean currents, yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Warren, very
Thank you.
much. And thank you all for coming. It's been a great hour. And grab a piece of, I don't know if there's any pizza left. And those of you that asked a question, if you'll see Amy at the back, she's got a special gift for you.
Huh?
With that, thanks everybody. Have a great evening.